This week on the Pathways to Success, we're going to bridge the gap between millennials and baby boomers, or at least try to. What's happening, everyone, and welcome back to the Pathways to Success podcast. I'm super excited about the guests I have on the show today. I have Tony Fleo, the CEO of Social Venture Partners of Dallas, as well as Sean Cahoe, the Director of Innovation and Strategy for SVP. Welcome to the podcast, guys.
Hey, glad to be here. Thanks, man.
Yeah, all right. Well, the topic of today's conversation really is about advice for millennials. And I was really excited about this because when I just wanted to have Tony and the guys on, and I had no idea what they wanted to talk about. But when I asked them, what do you want to talk about in the podcast? Pretty instantly, they said, advice for millennials. So I guess first off, why is this topic important for today's day and age?
Well, I want to nuance that a little bit.
Okay.
It's not just advice for millennials. It's advice for old people on how to get along with millennials in the workplace. Because the culture divide is so great.
Yep.
You know, like how you started out already today, where you said you were super excited. When did super become a word that is put in front of every other word in your vocabulary, in your age group?
Wow. I don't know. It's just the way that I talk.
Tony, I think the important thing is that it is a word we use, and you can use it too. You know, it's safe.
But it's so redundant and so overused. It's like your vocabularies are so limited, you young people, that you can only say super excited, super stoked. Whatever the thing is, it's always super. Isn't that weird?
Okay. So I guess first off, let's qualify a few things real quick, right? Because so let's first start from a baseline. What is a millennial? The reason being because I think I'm a millennial, just really tail end, but there's almost like subcategories within the millennial generation. Unpack that for us, if you would.
Yeah, sure. So the lines here are fuzzy. I mean, people talk about this a lot of different ways. I mean, even kind of people that study kind of generational differences kind of disagree on where these lines are really drawn, right? But if you're looking at it purely from an age range, generally agreed that kind of early to mid 80s,
Okay.
through kind of early 2000s are where millennials fall.
That's a pretty big gap.
It is, yeah.
And so in reality, Julian, you're not quite in the group, actually.
Not quite in the group?
Yeah.
Okay, and what group am I in then?
Because you're respectful, and so you don't really qualify.
Gotcha, all right.
I'll
take that.
He's trying to say that he's less annoyed by you than he is by me most of the time, so it's a compliment.
So I guess what are some of and the thing is that the millennial generation seems to get hit with a bunch of different like slogans and stereotypes. I guess what are some of the ones that you guys have seen that are prevalent? And it's interesting to have kind of different perspectives, Sean and also Tony. So I guess what do you think about that?
So when I show up for work every day at Social Venture Partners, I have a new appreciation for my grandparents when they immigrated from Italy and came to Ellis Island. Mm-hmm. And they were coming into a whole new culture with a different language, different value system. So they were immigrants. And so my generation is really immigrants in this new culture that is driven by the millennials. You have your own language, which is technology. You clearly have your own vocabulary, which is completely different. The super thing is really annoying. And you have this whole sense of values that we do not necessarily share. So in the workplace, there's a conflict of values all the time coming up every day.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of these values that you've seen have been consistent in the millennial generation? And I've heard that once in a while you and Sean have a tendency to disagree with some things, so I'm curious for you guys to sort of unpack that.
I'm sure we'll find one to disagree on, yeah.
So maybe we should talk a little bit about our roles at Social Venture Partners.
Yeah, give us a little bit of context as far as what Social Venture Partners is. I'm a proud partner of the organization, but for our listening and viewing audience, help us kind of understand what you guys do.
Sure. So you're our marketing person, strategy, marketing. Maybe you should answer the question.
Sure.
And then I'll correct it.
Right. So broadly, Social Venture Partners Dallas is a network of philanthropists, professionals here in Dallas that come together to not only give kind of resources in more of a traditional sense of philanthropy, but to give their time, talent, their networks to helping other organizations here in North Texas do good better. And SVP Dallas is actually one chapter of Social Venture Partners International, which is an organization of more than 40 chapters across 9 countries. And so the network kind of even broadens out from just North Texas.
So being in the philanthropic space, of course, we're driven by values and purpose and mission every single day. So we have those conversations regularly about how do we reach people where they are and what they value. And so actually having the different generational perspective in the office every day is a real benefit, despite how much it annoys me.
Gotcha, okay. And just in my personal experience with SVP, whenever I speak to someone who's never been exposed to it, I kind of compare it to the Shark Tank. Everyone knows the Shark Tank, right? And that's how we have served the nonprofit community as well as mission-driven organizations, is through financial resources as well as with our talents. And something that I keep being blown away by is the caliber of individuals that we have as part of this organization: CEOs, high-level entrepreneurs, people at very diverse backgrounds and disciplines. And it's amazing to see what we can do as an organization to scale an impact of doing good better.
So one of the things that we're very conscious of is trying to discern what people value, where they want to live their life and their purpose, and help them find that and bring together like-minded people to have a greater impact with their values and what they want to do. And so the values conversation is a really critical one to our work. Well, it's also a critical one to understanding how we bridge the tension between the entitled generation and the hardworking, respectful, loyal generation that I come from.
We're the generation that deeply cares to improve things versus the generation that's just entrenched in the status quo.
Okay, so let's unpack that then. Okay, so what would you say are the main conflicting values that the two generations have?
Loyalty, respect.
You really feel like millennials don't have loyalty?
Millennials do not have loyalty to anyone but themselves.
Sean, what's your response to that, man?
I mean, this is the really interesting thing about this conversation, and part of the reason that I think the conversation is so worth having is that even in how we describe these things, the terms we use, the values we identify with ourselves and with others, look different from our different perspectives, right? And so Tony uses these words, and I fully appreciate that is definitely his perspective on this. Though I don't. We are in essence speaking a different language about these things, right? And so I think there's a lot to kind of glean from just having the conversation. I think this is why it's so important that both people are in the room speaking with one another about this.
So let's take for example, the other day, I had scheduled a staff meeting with the team. And I was on a conference call that ran longer. And so I was 15 minutes late to the staff meeting that I had called. Now, when I walked in the conference room, what do you think I expected to see?
Them working and getting after it, right?
I expected to see them in the conference room, ready to have a meeting with me.
Right, yeah.
But no, none of them were there. So I was 15 minutes late, sat down at an empty conference room table, and then they all came streaming in. And I said, so we should really clarify this. Like in my day, working for the many bosses that I have worked, if they called a meeting, I was there in the meeting waiting for them. Their impression is, well, we don't really need to be there because you're not there. And so whenever you get there, we'll straggle in. It's just little things like that that are so annoying.
Okay, interesting. I believe as an organization, you guys are really trying to do good better, right? But I'm curious, I don't know if there's any really malicious intent behind their actions, I guess, but what was your perspective in this particular experience?
Malicious intent is not at all a consideration, but that does not negate the fact that the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
So what? How does the perspective differ from Tony's in this example?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, to give the example of that staff meeting, right, is there were a litany of other things that I could spend my 15, 20 minutes on, right? It was clear that Tony was held up on something else. And so I think each of us on the team just kind of made that judgment call that said, okay, the meeting's late, I can do other things with this time, right?
Interesting.
But that is indicative of a difference in norm, right? Tony's used to things kind of hitting on time. People are there, right? Regardless of whether or not that is the most productive use of time. But even kind of that thought of what's most productive in an efficiency sense versus what's most productive from a value sense of sitting with one another and being in the room together. That speaks to the idea that each of us was aiming at a different thing. Each of us had different expectations for that situation.
So do you think that's a generational thing, or do you think it's just kind of a communication and expectation setting thing, I guess?
No, I think it's very clearly a generational thing.
Okay.
I think that the millennial generation is pretty self-consumed, and my generation was more other-consumed.
What is your generation, just so we can put a label in it during our conversation?
Baby boomers.
Baby boomers, okay. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, so little things like that, but
So for
what
instance,
else? I really am just kind of curious.
Here's another
Yeah, yeah.
example, right?
Right.
So that would be my value for respect,
Sure.
which is interpreted completely differently.
You felt
right?
disrespected
Felt
in this moment because did you feel like you guys were disrespecting him by not?
Not in the least, no.
Okay,
And that was one of the interesting things. Is as
Yeah.
soon as Tony sat down, I knew. I was like, Tony's perturbed. What are we about to hear, right? Which is great, and he was certain to let us know, which was that he didn't feel respected by that, right?
Okay.
That had not occurred to me in the least. I mean, respect or any issue around that was not a thought. I honestly, I mean, to what Tony's saying, and this is me speaking for myself, not to say this is a generational thing. It might be though, but
Sure.
Considering Tony or considering of other people's work in the day didn't occur to me in that moment. It was, what can I get done with this time, right? Which is actually a little narcissistic. It was focused on my work. And one thing I will point out as kind of a broad thing, this conversation gets had in so many ways. There's so many different points that get brought up. But the one that I hear coming up consistently is that millennials are entitled and millennials are narcissistic. Entitlement can look like a lot of different things.
Yeah.
The narcissism one is really interesting to me because it actually tests, like it plays out in studies, is that multiple studies have shown that millennials are testing as more narcissistic than previous generations were at the same age.
So there was a science saying that's true?
For sure, yeah, and we can share the link.
You don't think my perception of you need science to back up my
No,
perception?
I don't. I'm just curious about it. Like, I'm trying to think of what are the things that we could sort of objectify and really kind of learn from. Maybe because of technology with selfies and stuff. I mean, why? Why is this happening?
Yeah, well, so again, this is disagreed on by plenty of people, and everybody kind of has their own pet theory. But yeah, I think one thing to realize is just that things have changed. The context I grew up in was radically different than the context Tony grew up in, and maybe even pretty different than the context you grew up in.
Yeah.
The impact that technology had on my life it's always been there. I don't remember a time when computers weren't there, when I couldn't really reach out to people. I mean, from fairly young ages of when I really wanted to be in touch with my friends, I could text them anytime. They were always there. And so, these are profound differences. I mean, they might seem small because we all have cell phones. We all do this now, but it can have a pretty profound impact to grow up in a different context.
So one of the things that I am really becoming more and more comfortable with is the reverse mentoring role. So I look to these guys to help me navigate this culture all the time. Like, I did not grow up with technology. So when I think about how first generation children that are born here, have to help their immigrant parents navigate the American culture, I have to have the office children help me navigate the culture at hand. Because there's a lot of things on my computer that I cannot do that they make fun of me for not being able to do. But you just heard him admit that he grew up with it and I was just dumped in it. So that's a very different experience, right? So we have to look to them to mentor us. Now, it would probably behoove me to get a mentor his age that isn't an employee, and maybe they would be nicer about my inadequacies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm curious then, as far as like the baby boomer generation, what you mentioned technology, but are there other topics that you would want that mentoring from that might help your generation, or?
Well, I think Sean used a very important word, when he said narcissistic.
Yeah.
So I need some mentoring about how to be more narcissistic. For
You don't
instance,
need any mentoring in that. Tony.
For instance, there was another staff meeting that we were having when a colleague of mine came to drop something off to the office. And of course, I got up to go greet him and then had him come into the room to meet the staff. And I asked him to sit down and talk about his mission and share a little bit about what their organization is with my staff. When he left, they were so annoyed that I had done that. It interrupted their work and what they needed to get done. To me, that was a value of hospitality and welcoming and respect to one of my colleagues. And it was also an opportunity for the team to get to know some other organization out there and what they're doing. But it was a real clash of values. Their deal was they had certain things to accomplish in that meeting, and I derailed it by inviting someone in to sit down and visit with them. Do you remember that day, Sean?
I do remember that day. Yeah, and this is, to Tony's point that there's an opportunity for reverse mentoring. I think it's absolutely worth mentioning that mentoring and being open to the idea of that, being open to learning from the values that Tony holds, can be hugely important and has been hugely important to me personally. I mean, just being friends with Tony and getting to work alongside him day to day and have these fights, see these moments, has taught me a lot. And specifically in this instance, that's been one that I reflect on all the time because being hospitable to this person is, again, something that just didn't occur to me. I don't know if that's personal or is broadly generational, but it's certainly one that, the idea that, just being together in person has that just immense intrinsic value is something I've taken away from Tony deeply. And that, to go back to the technology thing, I mean, I think that's an interesting part is, when you see, so waiting on a meeting to start, right? When you see millennials kind of waiting on a thing, oftentimes we're just on our phones looking at Facebook, right? That's how we kill time, versus actually engaging one another in conversation. And so this is where, whether it's just technology or other factors, we're certainly predisposed to different kind of habits and patterns in how we deal with our time. And what we do with that, and hospitality, genuinely engaging with another human being that you don't know, just because you have the opportunity, because the time is there, or making the time for that intentionally, has definitely been something that I've been taking away from this, right?
Interesting. And how long have you guys been working together?
A year and a half, 2 years, almost.
So there's that hospitality piece. Like, what else have you learned from Tony's generation that has benefited you and perhaps other millennials watching?
Yeah, so, I think another kind of big piece of this that I think is just worth making commentary on, at least from my side, has been an element of reality. Maybe that inspiration doesn't count for quite as much as millennials like to hope that it does, right? I know for me and for a lot of my friends, we've grown up with kind of this prevalence of self-help. You can find all these inspiring quotes on Instagram all the time. You can watch all your motivational videos on Facebook. And at the end of the day, whether or not that actually makes you a better person or changes anything in the world, probably it doesn't. Probably you can watch all the motivational videos you want, but unless you just choose to participate, you choose to jump in and do the gritty hard work day to day, probably it doesn't change you that much. And that's something that Tony's been really intentional about pushing, is that just getting involved, just taking that first step towards actually doing the work is going to count for so much more than any inspiration you could find or kind of fluffy feel-good thing you could put on. And so just as an example, I think there is an element of hard work maybe to be attributed to older generations that, I don't know, there's stuff to be learned there for sure.
And there's clearly a paradigm difference around time, right? So when you're a baby boomer, you realize that you have fewer days on this earth than the millennials do as they look forward, right?
That makes sense.
So we have a clear sense of urgency about achieving things and a time period in which they need to be achieved and what is really important and what is not. And that's hard to communicate a bit. That sense of urgency, now is the time, we got to do it now. And you don't have like 20 years to accomplish it anymore. So that's a bit of a paradigm shift as well. So all culture, right, is based on values, and the values of the baby boomers and the values of the millennials are very, very different. And it's not that one is, well, I will say that one is better than the other, but it's not to say that the values, like communication, there is a clear value in being able to communicate, but that's not the superior value when it comes to that. The superior value is conversation. Communication is one way. I don't have to listen, receive, get changed, get transformed, but having a real conversation requires us to spend the time, and it's a give and take.
Yeah.
It is astounding to me how few millennials know how to have a real conversation. You can ask them a question and they'll talk about themselves, but to turn it around and for them to actually say, and tell me a little bit about you, requires some coaching. Because the communication thing is also one way. Communication is definitely a value. I believe there is a higher value, though, that is conversation. So it's taking the leap of values and making them, reaching the ones that are maybe more critical to the culture.
Tony, how do you feel like someone can learn conversation or adopt that value? I mean, if somebody wanted to realizes maybe that's something they could work on, what do you do about that?
Well, obviously, there are some folks who are really good at conversation, and so you be intentional and deliberate about visiting with them and having them share it with you how they do it. You're good at that. You have conversations with people all the time.
Yeah.
Here you are. You ask questions about them, and they give a response. Do they ask questions back to you?
They do, usually, and I don't know if this is just kind of a blessing that I have, but I have just a real natural interest in other people. And when I'm interested in other people...
And that's because you're not really a millennial.
Okay, I guess. I'm born in 82, whatever that means. But yeah, no, I mean, that seemed to have served me. I have interest in other people, it comes up genuinely, and they have interest in me back. And then we dialogue.
And I do believe that millennials have interest in other people. I just don't think that they've ever really been challenged or taught or cajoled into the finer arts of doing these things in a different way.
Do you think they just haven't seen the tangible value of getting to know people and connecting with them in person? I mean, is that where there's a disconnect? Because, I mean, the millennial, when people think of communication, I think when millennials, like when I see my kids, they think communication is texting or, Instagram or whatever. That's not really what I consider to be communication. Communication is connecting. It's getting to know you as a person.
I mean, this is how our values, this is how significant it is, though, this whole communication value. I will have some of my staff members come to me and say, so-and-so will not respond to an email. And I'm like, call them.
Call them, yeah.
Millennials do not make phone calls.
True or false? I think I'm in between you guys in terms of viewpoint.
That's interesting. No, millennials don't use phones. Not
Wait,
for the
you
phone
do you do admit this? Like you don't pick up the phone?
Yeah, sure. I think generally this
Interesting.
is true. Yeah.
Is it because you don't see the value, or you're afraid to pick up the phone?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. A bit of both, maybe. It's definitely one that if I can achieve in a text message what would otherwise take a 5-minute phone call,
Efficiency.
I'd rather send the text. But there's also just a norm there, right? And so when you say, are you afraid to do it? I realize, some moments there might be some hesitancy just because it's not a thing I did all the time, right?
In your view, then, when is it appropriate to make a phone call?
Ooh. Honestly, I don't know that I've thought very clearly about.
So if I have a heart attack at the office, you'll call 911 instead of text?
Yeah, I don't know.
911.
That'd
Tony
be great.
has a heart
Might look to see if there's an online chat I can use, submit my request.
But again, therein lies a value difference, right? So effectiveness was the value that we strive for.
Yeah.
And efficiency is the value. If I've had one millennial tell me that we don't have to work hard because we work smart one more time, that is so annoying. So they're smarter than the prior generation. They're more efficient. Efficiency doesn't always carry the day. Sometimes effectiveness is the higher value and the higher priority. So one of the things you should always think about is use efficiency with things and effectiveness with people.
That
Those are
makes
two
sense.
entirely
Yeah.
different ways of
Totally.
dealing with things, right? But efficiency then is moved from things to people as well. Be as efficient as you can with people. You just lose so much in that.
So I don't think I heard the response from you. When is it appropriate to have a conversation over the phone or in person?
It's definitely more personal, right?
Yeah.
And so specifically, when there's something personal to be discussed, I think is a good line, right? And I definitely realize that it is inherently more impersonal to text someone.
Okay.
So yeah, I don't know that there's a
comes to
hard and
person.
fast rule there,
Okay.
for sure. And I will say that it's not that it feels wrong to call someone.
Yeah.
More just that it feels unorthodox to call someone a lot of the time.
That's interesting, right? That is definitely a generational difference right there.
Yeah.
Tony, I'm curious, when do you think it's appropriate to send a text message or Facebook post or whatever?
So I'm a big fan of texting, and I'm a big
Yeah.
fan of Facebook. Facebook's connected me to my relatives all over the world,
Sure,
and it's
exactly.
wonderful. So I get to keep up with everything that everybody's doing and all that great stuff.
Yeah.
But that is not a real relationship, right? And so, again, those two words, being intentional and deliberate about relationships, however you determine that or who are the ones that you want to have, they don't just happen organically. You have to take the initiative
Yeah.
and create opportunities to have real conversations, real relationships. And so when anything is going to be the least bit contentious or there's going to be some conflict, I think it's always better to do that over the phone or in person or to deal with it. Other things are much more efficient with text and that kind of thing, so for sure. But it's not a one rule applies to it all.
Sure.
So the efficiency rule for me that the millennials use does not apply to all circumstances.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, I use technology to set up a conversation, usually. It's usually a means to an end for another event. I'm curious though, do you feel that millennials have less quality relationships because of the way they communicate with one another?
Yes, I do.
Sean?
I think that there's a quality quantity issue, but yes, I do.
Yeah.
I don't know that I want to make kind of a broad claim for my generation
Yeah.
on this one. It's hard for me
Okay,
to,
well, you then,
to-
just you, yeah.
Yeah, to speak for everyone. But I can absolutely tell you that in learning a lot of the things I have from Tony about how to have a conversation with someone, about how to keep a strong relationship, how to keep someone close, or to build a stronger bond to someone, my relationships have improved for sure.
Interesting.
And so I absolutely think there's wisdom in what Tony's saying. And there are facets here of just interacting with people that it doesn't matter whether or not you have a new medium for it. The fact that you're a person and I'm a person and we're trying to have a meaningful conversation, a meaningful dialogue, doesn't change. And so I think there's a lot to be gleaned from older generations and that people that have been doing this a little longer.
Yeah. So that's a theme. I think I've asked that question a couple times, and you mentioned the same thing. And I look for commonalities and responses.
Yeah.
But it seems like the biggest thing you're getting from Tony's generation is connection.
It's a huge part of it, for
Yeah.
sure. It's a huge part of it.
Is there anything else that you've learned that's really important, that's been very useful to you in your professional career?
Yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of things, but you're keen to pick up on that. And if I had to narrow it to a single greatest impact, I think that's been a lot of what I've learned from Tony specifically, but also just broadly, kind of the mentors I've had, is that a depth of engagement with the people around you will benefit you enormously.
I believe that too, yeah.
I also see a more openness in my team, the younger generation, to avail themselves of opportunities more. Like, I just voluntold Sean that he would come and do this podcast. Now, maybe earlier on in our working relationship, he would have said no.
You were reluctant? How dare you?
No, I was excited as soon as I got the offer.
He was super excited as soon as he got the offer.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So I think that, opportunity dances with those who are already on the dance floor. That's something that you learn when you're old, looking back on your life, that you got to be in the game. And then you have a much better chance of having the purpose, finding the meaning, being in the place where the opportunities happen than not being in the game, right? You have to be on the dance floor. You can't be sitting on the sidelines. And it reminds me of a time when we were at a philanthropic event and Sean refused to dance with one of our biggest donors.
Really?
Yeah, that is something that will stick in my memory for a really long time. And so those are the kinds of things that you have to work on with the next generation, right?
Wow.
For what it's worth, I only found out she was a major donor after the fact. So
interesting. Huh.
Julian, I'm kind of curious.
Yeah.
I mean, you've been listening to some of the things Tony and I have said, and age-wise, I mean, yeah, it sounds like you technically kind of fall into the generation between Tony and I.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious if you, one, find yourself falling towards either side of what we're saying, or two, feel distinctly in the middle. Like, what is your experience of all
I
this
feel
personally?
distinctly in the middle because I see value in both what you're saying and this conversation is really enlightening to me because the biggest difference that I'm seeing is the way that we're communicating with one another. And the only factor really that is in between that created that is technology. And I can see how that's creating a further and further divide in terms of the way that we connect with individuals. But in terms of just my ideas about millennials in general, I hire a ton of them, right? I'm a recruiting professional. I've hired so many of them. And the thing is that I've heard these slogans about them being entitled, about them, wasting time and being all these different kinds of things. And the thing is, I've seen it in millennials and I've seen it in more matured workers before. That's why for me personally, I kind of have a tendency to lean towards the individual and not try to make blanket statements, but be aware of these things. If I'm trying to recruit someone or trying to get to know someone, be aware of these themes and see if it's true for me as I engage with the individual, right? Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. And obviously, when I make these blanket statements, I am making them for effect. But the most incredible thing I think about what the possibilities. I think about the gifts. I think about the strengths. If you want to be effective and you go to another country and you want to do business in another country, the first thing you do is you study their cultural norms in order not to be offensive to anyone and to be more effective, right? I don't think there's a lot of time spent in really understanding the cultural norms that literally exist between the two cultures, between the baby boomers culture and the millennial culture. It's almost as if no one acknowledges that they really are two different cultures.
I don't think people think about that.
And they are completely different cultures. And to be more effective, like you would going to a foreign country, you want to really learn about the values and try to honor them as much as you can.
Right.
And I really do think that the secret sauce is in this reverse mentoring, that we do play a mentoring role to the younger employee, but they also play a mentoring role to us in the future, in the now, in how to be more efficient, all of those things that they are so good at, right? So I think being open to the dual, it's the Jungian shadow side, right? For everything that is dominant, there is a shadow side, and I think allowing that emerging shadow side to come out and be present really helps a lot. I think my team would say that I learn a lot from you.
Of course, every day.
I may complain about it and criticize it, but I learn a great deal from the way in which you enter the world.
So that's interesting. So I asked Sean what was the biggest thing that he learned from the baby boomers, and that was connection, communication, that kind of thing. And I think you answered it already, technology. But is there anything else that you would recommend to, your colleagues or anyone who's in the baby boomer generation who might employ or work with that you would think would behoove them to learn from the millennial generation?
Oh my gosh, the thing that is so overwhelming to me is how brilliant they are.
Yeah.
Really and
I
truly.
agree.
Because they've had such an enormous amount of interaction with knowledge and great education systems, and they just know so much. But for my generation, the rules are the same, to have that conversation, to sit down and really learn the story of the other person. We at Social Venture Partners, we do the Dana Jewett Venture Philanthropy Program for 20-something professionals. It's a academic year residency program learning about philanthropy and what works and we have a tagline, do good better, and we believe there is a way to do good better. And so we spend an academic year, one Saturday, do a weekend retreat in the September, and then one Saturday a month we spend 4 hours together learning different topics of philanthropy. And a cornerstone to every one of those sessions is conversation, one-on-one conversations. And I did one at this last residency with a young African-American kid who's working in Dallas, and we had a real conversation about each other's story. And it turns out that our stories, even though he's 20-something, African-American from another part of the country than I grew up in, our stories were so strikingly similar because of our fathers and the role that our fathers played in our lives and the role that our fathers played in the community, that getting to know him like that on that level, my respect for him immediately goes up. He is no longer a millennial to me. He is now a person with a real story, with something that I can learn from, something that I can be in a real relationship with, despite our differences in race, despite our differences in age, despite all of the differences. The story gives the commonality.
So how do we start? What's working in bridging that connection? What's working for you guys? Y'all still together after 2 years, right? You haven't killed each other?
Sean,
Drink together.
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the things I learned from him was where the best old fashions in town are. So he introduced me to that, and so that's how
Best
our
fashion?
old fashions. It's a
Old
drink.
fashions. Oh, okay, it's a drink. Gotcha. All right. Yeah.
Sometimes trendy pays off. You know, the millennials are very trendy, and so they know where the best things are. At least
Cool
they think
things,
they do, except when it comes to workspaces and coffee. The absurdity of what they do around coffee and co-working spaces is just that I will never understand.
We like working together.
But
I don't understand what your problem is.
See, working together, when you walk into a co-working space, just because you're all sitting at the same table and have headphones on does not mean that you're actually working together. It means you're in close proximity to other people, which is annoying in and of itself, but you're not working together.
Feels great. It's exciting in those places. I like it.
Except when it comes to me being late for a staff meeting. They could have all been working at our common conference table that they all love so much to work side by side in a co-working space, but yet they couldn't show up for a meeting and work side by side until I got there. Do you see the logic in that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So going back to your question, Julian, of what's working. I think a lot of it is building those connections that go beyond the bounds of just a working relationship. Really getting to know someone.
That's good.
And that's, before Tony and I worked together, I mean, we did get cocktails together a few times, but we put time into building a relationship with one another. And that has made working together worlds better, right? And it's set the stage to where we can have a dialogue about these things. And that takes time, and it takes, using Tony's words, being intentional and deliberate about showing up for people outside of what's just necessary to get the work done, right? And so I think that's the place to start.
It's just getting to know the individual, really.
As an individual, as a person.
As a person,
I mean, when you're in
that makes sense.
When you're in a work situation, I'm spending more time with the people that I work with than, unfortunately, my family members.
Right.
So the notion of, really getting to know the person and the person's story is critical to building the trust. Covey writes about the speed of trust and how much quicker things can get done when you have that underlying trust. Well, for me, trust is built with a shared sense of value, a shared sense of purpose, and you can't find that purpose and value without the real conversations. And then when you have real conversations, all kinds of things come out, like your talents come out, and you figure out ways that you can link your talents to other people's talents and make something really great happen. And that's the synergy of it all, right? That's where the tension that lies between the two generations really is a lot of power when it's used in that positive way.
So I know one of your talents, one of your gifts is like organizational structure, right? So let's, is that right? Am I saying that correctly?
Yes.
Okay. So let's say that an organization is having some type of conflict, a generational conflict. So is the action item talk to each other? I mean, what is it?
I wouldn't say that the action item is just to talk to each other.
Yeah.
The action item is to really deal with culture. if you think about it just from a sociological perspective, right? Culture is built around the fire, and culture is built. It's a tribal thing, and tribes share the same values, and they share the same story. They share the same origination story. And one of the things that we fail to do, whether it's a business or whatever it is share the origination story on a regular basis. That's where the values surface, that's where the power comes from. So sharing the story and sharing the why we are interested and connected to that story is a much deeper way of getting to bridge the tension than just talking. I'm not talking about talking for the sake of talking. I'm talking about story, values, bonding.
Yeah, like a really deeper understanding in a real genuine way.
I think, you brought this up within the frame of, so there's a generational conflict. What do we do about it? How do we ameliorate that? And I think one point to be made is that there should be something that you work on before there's conflict, right? Trust has to be built over the long term. And so, working on these relationships, working on building community, having these campfire moments, so to speak, is something you can do now, right? Regardless of whether or not it seems like you may need it, or maybe there's no conflict now, but you can invest in this. And then by the time you actually have the conflict, suddenly the conflict becomes a catalyst. It's productive rather than just being a conflict.
For my generation, there are some sociologists that talk about if you were born before 1964, you are an immigrant in a new world.
Interesting.
Here in the United States. So for my generation, in many ways, we are immigrants in a new world. And immigrants are most successful when they have a network of guides around them. And I am very intentional and deliberate about building a network of guides, people who this is their time, this is their space, this is the culture that they are imbued with and are living out. It's not mine. So I need you guys to help me navigate it. As I'm making decisions to benefit this world, I have to have the input and the help from my guides. That goes a lot further when the respect is mutual, of course. When your generation understands that there are some things that we do know that you're open to as well, learning and hearing. So it's a reciprocity, it's a mutuality, it is a relationship. And in real relationships, those are the things that happen.
I think there's something to be said from the other side of this too, which is that millennials have this desire for change. We want to be influential. We want to see the world bend to what we want, right? It's Tony's generation that still has power. Through the networks they've built, through the resources they've gained, through the positions they hold. And so if you're going to have influence, you're going to have influence through a relationship. And if Tony's generation has the power, relationship with that generation is where you can exert influence. You can be influential to where things go. We don't have to wait until we have the power, right? We can be in relationship now and exert that influence there. But it does take reciprocity. It takes trust on both sides, actually knowing one another, being in a genuine relationship to have that.
That's good. So as far as commonalities, then, I know that something that obviously is evident in both generations is the importance of giving back. And something that I'm really seeing in the millennial generation is like there really does seem like there's this kind of altruistic bent to them looking for certain kinds of roles and stuff like that. So what are the benefits that the millennial generation are getting through social impact?
That's a sore subject, Joel.
Is it? Okay. Well, all I want to do is unpack the truth. So why is it?
So, and I'm going to use this word myth in the purest sense of story, not in lie. So there is this myth that the millennials have this purpose-driven life call that they want to be in. That's the story, right? Yeah. And I think on the surface, that is really true. One could interpret it as they just no longer wish to work hard and pay their dues for 20 years before they can go about and make a difference and be respected and taken seriously, which is probably what they should do, but that's not where we are. That's not the culture. The culture is the millennials are here now. They want to do it now. They want to have purpose. They want to work for purpose-driven companies. But yet, like, they don't go out and vote. That's just so annoying to me. It's as if they have no clue about what really makes change of power happen. Mm-hmm. But let's go with their version, that they individually want to have a purpose, right?
Okay, yeah.
And that is great. So what do we do with that? How do we organize that in any kind of meaningful way? Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that we spend a lot of time talking about. And there's a lot of research that goes into that, right? That millennials do not have any loyalty to a particular organization. They have loyalty to a cause. So you start to identify more causes and put them on projects where it is cause-oriented rather than organizational-oriented. So my generation, we would pick an organization or a charity or something that we were supportive of, and we would stick with that for years, mm-hmm. with the organization. Now it is with the cause, not the organization. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. It's the cause, not the organization itself.
Tony, how much do you think a preference toward relationship played into that? I mean, it seems like being behind a cause doesn't necessarily require that I know anyone personally, but if I was going to support an organization in particular for 20 years, I would expect to know people behind that.
Well, for sure. And I'm not sure that the millennials place a value on long-term relationships. Do you?
We'll see. We got a long time to go.
Well, something that I think maybe we can all agree on is the importance of community. I mean, obviously we've talked about some of the keys to bridging this gap is communication, is getting to know each other. So why is it important?
It's not communication.
Correct.
It's conversation.
It's okay, right. Conversation.
Real conversation.
I use the word connection. I think we're going after the same thing, just using different language.
You used communication.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. My intent was there. So, well, okay, so that, I think, is the commonality of a response to this, of bridging the gap. Do you agree or disagree?
Oh, I absolutely agree.
Okay. Would you also consider that, I know one of the things that I wanted to talk about is the importance of community and how SVP can help that as well. So why is it important for the millennial generation to join a kind of community?
So when you look at the impact, the old proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Mm-hmm. There is so much greater impact when you join forces with like-minded people who share your vision, share your purpose, and share your values. But that takes strategy, that takes commitment to the long haul, and that's a little bit of a harder sell to the millennial generation. They want immediate results, they want quick results, and if you don't get those, they're probably going to move on to somewhere else. But these kinds of systemic problems that Social Venture Partners Dallas is trying to solve just locally here in our own community, they didn't occur overnight. They're generations upon generations it took to get here. It's going to take a lot of strategy work to undo that. And that kind of thing, when you're talking about systems, is much better done in a group than alone. And so that's what Social Venture Partners brings, is the power of the group to have a greater impact on things.
And Sean, what's your view?
Yeah, well, so really quick, Julian, I was actually going to ask for a bit of your story.
Sure, yeah.
You've been participating in Social Venture Partners a while, and you've kind of heard Tony kind of set this out of why someone should participate in a community like this. But what's your thought, man? I mean, what has that done in your life?
I mean, this podcast is a manifestation of it, to be honest with you. But I mean, it really has. If there's one thing that I have learned deeply through SVP is that is this the more genuinely you try to help other people using the gifts and talents that you naturally have without expecting anything in return, the more I seem to have benefited in ways I could have never imagined, truly. When I first joined SVP, Tony reached me out. He picked me out of a crowd just from questions that I was asking, right? And I was sort of going in the direction of wanting to volunteer my services, but seeing how I uniquely could create an impact using my unique backgrounds and skills. I've done Habitat for Humanity, I folded sandwiches for the homeless. Those are great, and I'd probably do them again. But I wanted to see what kind of unique change I could create using my skills and talents. And that's why I joined SVP. And since then, I've been a part of amazing experiences. You know, I helped a nonprofit organization triple in size, get $100,000 funding to them in total, and I've seen the impact that I've been able to create just by trying to serve. So really, if there's one message that SVP has given me, is the importance of self-awareness, of stewardship, and of service. And those three pillars have completely changed my life. And that's a true story that you can verify, right, Tony?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think, but what is, SVP can do that, and we do that for a lot of folks. But we can't do that until the initial yes is there, until the person is willing to step forward, take a risk, and join a group that has some things to teach them, but also needs them. Each of us is created with our own set of strengths and our own skill set and our own purpose, if you will. But when it is linked with the skill sets of other people, where we can link our strengths with other people's weaknesses, if you will, and their strengths with our weaknesses, the power of that combination to do really great things in the world cannot be overstated.
Yeah.
And you are a living example of that. I joke with everybody, if they join SVP, they'll have a podcast and write a book and be a good-looking actor like you are. But whatever that is for the person that joins, that happens if they're intentional and deliberate about using all of the power of the network.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's like, for the longest time, I've always kind of seen myself, or wanted to be like this lone horse, like, oh, I can do this on my own. But I've really seen the power of working with other people. Like, you can only be great at sort of a few things, right? But when you combine your talents with others, it's amazing what happened. The whole thing that I mentioned with SkillQuest is the name of the nonprofit organization. I kind of project managed that whole thing, but it was George Ellis, it was Pawan Jaggi, it was everyone else who combined all their thoughts and expertise, and together we were able to create that change. And that's been pretty awesome.
And I think that's one of the things that we're pretty open to as a team, we spend a lot of time with each other's strengths from the Strength Finders assessment, which I am a big fan of. Yeah. It's on the Gallup website, and you can go and get your top 5 talents, and we spend a lot of time looking at each other's talents and putting people on projects that their talents are natural fits for, rather than doing traditional job descriptions. This is the job, now go do this job. I like to look at it, and we share this a bit, is we look at it from where our strengths are, and then we go do the jobs that fit our strengths.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty powerful thing.
That is a really powerful thing. Yeah.
And I've seen that, in Sean's case, Sean is an extraordinarily talented person. And getting to be able to find roles at Social Venture Partners, which is true for employees or people who come as partners, getting to actually use their talents, all of them, is a pretty extraordinary experience.
So Sean, I guess just to kind of wrap all this up, if you could tell our viewers and millennials and generation the importance of doing something like this. What you're there, so what is the importance of it?
Yeah, absolutely. If I had a word of advice, I think it would land in participate. There's so much room to write off a system that we don't believe in, or be pessimistic about what we can really do, or we have these ideals and values we want, which is great. Just dive in, just participate, find a group that you can join, take the risk, and stick with it long enough to actually get to know the people that are there. And it's incredible what you can do. And there is so much to be learned on both sides of that. I guess further in that point would be find a group that is diverse across every metric. The ability to have a conversation across cultures is profound. It has so much to yield. And so I think that's my note, is don't get hung up on the cynicism, just participate.
Cool. And how do people learn more about Social Venture Partners of Dallas? How do they connect? How do they join? How do they learn more?
So we have a website, Social Venture Partners Dallas, that you can look at. We have an extraordinary event coming up on the last Thursday of October called Big Bang, which is a place where the way it came into origin many years ago is it was a place intentionally and deliberately set up where suits and boots could come together. People who cared about the same issues but were working on them in their silos could come together and see what could happen. What could be the big bang if all the people who are working on these issues separately come together and work on them together. So we certainly invite you to check that out. Any other options for the ways people get engaged with social venture partners?
Website, social.
Yeah, I'm sure Tony's email is on the website somewhere, so I would just bombard his inbox and be sure he has plenty of people to meet with.
And all the millennials can like us on Facebook, or is that something they don't do anymore? They're all on some other...
No, find us on Facebook, find us on Twitter, find us on Instagram. We're SVP Dallas pretty much everywhere. So.
And we'll make sure to have all the connection links in the show notes as well. So guys, this has been awesome, man. I think
it's been a blast.
It's been awesome.
Thanks.
Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, this has been great. So everyone, thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Pathways to Success. As always, make sure to subscribe, comment, and share. Share this out with everyone that you know. Connect with the Social Venture Partners of Dallas, and we'll see you next week on the next episode of the Pathways to Success.